Welcome back to Spy Tech Files. You're sitting in a crowded room, Langley, Virginia. The air is thick with smoke and desperation. It is 1961. The map on the wall is massive, the Caribbean, and a single, blood-red circle isolates the island of Cuba, less than 90 miles from Florida. This island is more than just a speck on a map. It's an obsession. It's where the Cold War came ashore, and in a few short weeks, it will become the graveyard of the CIA's most humiliating failure, the Bay of Pigs. Before we descend into that disaster, let me ask you, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing the Spy Tech Files community spread across the globe. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and tap that like button. It fuels the hidden files they never wanted you to know. All right, let's open the file. This is a journey through declassified history. The story doesn't begin on the beach. It begins in 1959. A charismatic rebel, Fidel Castro, storms into Havana. He overthrows Fulgencio Batista, a dictator quietly backed by American corporate interests. For Washington, Batista was predictable. He kept Cuba an open playground. Castro's revolution changes everything. He nationalizes American businesses and throws out U.S. advisors. Most terrifyingly of all, he edges closer and closer to the Soviet Union. To Washington, communism is a disease, and now it's landed less than 100 miles from American shores. President Eisenhower listens as CIA analysts warn that Castro is a beachhead for Soviet power in the Western Hemisphere. Something had to be done. The CIA steps forward with a plan. A covert operation. Train a small army of Cuban exiles, arm them, and send them back to spark an internal uprising. It sounded surgical. It sounded plausible. And most importantly, it sounded deniable. But plausible deniability is often just a myth invented in a conference room. This mission, codenamed Operation Pluto, was a gamble on the premise that Castro was weak. Intelligence reports detailing his strong popular support were ignored. Warnings about his well-armed military were softened. The CIA's confidence was dangerously high. Recruitment begins quietly. Secret training camps spring up in the jungles of Guatemala. Instructors teach sabotage, demolitions, and guerrilla warfare. They whisper a promise to the recruits. America has your back. We will never abandon you. A promise that will be broken in the most brutal way imaginable. This operation wasn't just about men and rifles. It was a Cold War test case for the new wave of espionage technology and covert logistics. Think about the tech the CIA was leveraging. They were using early, bulky cryptographic systems for secure communications between Langley and the command ships offshore. They relied heavily on U-2 spy plane photography, pioneering intelligence technology to map the Cuban coastline and track troop movements. The air operation relied on a deception. B-26 bombers were painted to look like defecting Cuban planes. A classic piece of deception technology. But here's the lesson from this declassified history. Advanced tech only works if the basic intelligence is sound. The airstrikes failed to eliminate Castro's air force, and the deception fooled no one. Castro immediately denounced the attacks at the UN. Washington's cover story collapsed instantly. The file is handed to the new young president, John F. Kennedy. He's barely settled in the White House when he's told the CIA has an army ready to invade. To cancel now would be politically humiliating. Kennedy reluctantly agrees to proceed, but makes one fateful adjustment to preserve deniability. He scales back direct U.S. air support. That single decision turned a risky mission into a guaranteed disaster. On April 17, 1961, the invasion force approached the southern coast. This was supposed to be a quiet landing. Instead, the night is ripped open by searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. Castro's men were waiting. The surprise was gone. As the sun rose, the exiles waded onto the beaches of Playa Girón. The terrain was a nightmare. Swamps, mangroves, limited mobility. And the promised uprising? It never materialized. The Cuban people weren't cheering them as liberators. They were fighting them as invaders. Overhead, Castro's few surviving T-33 jets, the planes the CIA had failed to destroy, roared into action. They strafed the beaches and, critically, sank the vital supply ships offshore. Within hours, the exiles were stranded. No food, no ammunition, no air cover. They were alone. Back in Washington, Kennedy faced the terrible moment of truth. Should he send in U.S. jets to save the men? He had to choose between saving the mission and preventing an open war with the Soviet Union. Fearing escalation, Kennedy chose restraint. The exiles radioed for help, but no American planes flew to their rescue. The promise was broken. On April 19th, the final resistance was overrun. Over 1,100 men captured. For Castro, it was the ultimate triumph. For the CIA, a disaster of arrogance and incompetence. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a military defeat. It was a geopolitical earthquake. It hardened Castro's grip and drove him straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. And within a year, Soviet missiles would be on Cuban soil, sparking the Cuban Missile Crisis, the heavy price of a catastrophic intelligence failure. But there is a lesson in this declassified history that is acutely relevant to our world today. The lesson of the information war. The failure wasn't due to poor tech. It was due to poor data integrity and cognitive bias. CIA analysts believed what they wanted to believe, ignoring the reality that didn't fit the desired narrative. This is the very root of modern cybercrime and digital age threats. Organizations ignore security warnings because they believe it won't happen to them, just as the CIA ignored warnings about Castro's strength. The invasion failed because essential support, air cover, and supplies was withdrawn. In modern terms, this is a failure of incident response planning. If your system is hit by ransomware, what is your air cover? Do you have robust, segregated, tested backups? Can you operate manually if everything else fails? Our experience in fighting digital age crime boils down to 3 steps, straight from the lessons of the Bay of Pigs. Prevention. Stop making assumptions. Don't trust. Verify. Implement multi-factor authentication everywhere. Remediation. Accept that failure is possible. The plan isn't to prevent everything, it's to contain and isolate the threat immediately. Consequence management. The recovery isn't just about IT. Have your crisis communications plan ready before the disaster strikes. The Bay of Pigs was a story of young men betrayed, of arrogance, and of superpowers testing each other's resolve. For Kennedy, it was a humiliation that taught him to never trust the intelligence community so blindly again. For Castro, it was the victory that secured his revolution. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why we call it another case file closed in the Spy Tech Files. Smash that like button, drop a comment on which CIA disaster you want the declassified history of next, and hit subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.